In this lesson, we'll introduce one of React's key features, which is props. So first up, what is a prop? A prop is a piece of data that we pass from a parent component to a child component. It is data that we can provide that will flow down from a parent to a child. It can be any kind of data that we want. It can be a number, a string, a Boolean, an object, an array, any valid JavaScript data type. The more important detail is that it is something that we allow to pass from the parent component that is rendering a child component. The cool thing about props is if the prop value updates in the parent component, for example, if its value changes, then the child component will receive the new value. And that process is continuous. So as long as the parent component is rendering a child component and passing a prop value to it, if that prop changes, then the child component will be alerted. So on the right-hand side, you can see my sample graphic. I do want to warn you that I'm not much of an artist, but here what we have is a parent component and it is rendering a child component. That is the box in yellow. And you can see that little blob of data, that is props. That is flowing down into the child component, and the child component is able to do something with that data. It can display it, it can use it to perform some kind of logic. All kinds of operations are possible. The idea that it is data that is going into the child. So there's a couple important prop ideas that are important to understand and to memorize. The first of which is that props are meant to be immutable and read-only. What that basically means is that they should not change. The child component should not modify or update them in any way. So for example, if the parent component is passing an object down as a prop, it is not a good idea for the child to add a property to that object or delete a property. As another example, if a parent component is passing down an array to a child component, it is not a good idea for the child component to add an element to the array or remove an element from the array. The idea is the props should be read-only. They are just data that is flowing down that the child component can use. So what this design creates is what we call a one-directional data flow. What that means is data flows only in one direction. It flows down from parent to child, and that creates a predictable pattern. Because as soon as the child potentially modifies a prop, we create the accidental potential for side effects. In other words, something that the child does has a potential to affect the object in the parent or elsewhere in the codebase. We have this design, this paradigm, this best practice in React that all data is going to flow downwards in one direction, basically like a waterfall. The parent component takes data, passes it down to the child can read it and process it and do something with it, including pass it down again to perhaps another child component, but it should not modify it. It should not mutate it because that creates a lot of danger. So it's also important to note, of course, that this relationship of props can exist multiple levels and multiple components down. So on the right-hand side in that graphic, you can see the idea that our blue parent component is passing down props, or once again, data to a child component, and the child component can take that collection of props and pass it down to its own child, which is the grandchild component of the original parent. But the child component can also introduce new data or new props, that is that red bubble to the right, that also flows down to the grandchild. So this is a totally valid pattern. It's just to demonstrate the idea that these props can continually flow down many different levels or layers down your component hierarchy. So the React documentation states it best. It says, any state is always owned by some specific component, and any data or UI derived from that state can only affect components below them in the tree. So if you imagine a component tree as a waterfall of props, each component state is like an additional water source that joins it at an arbitrary point, but always flows down. So that waterfall analogy is super helpful here, and it demonstrates the idea that everything always moves in one direction. A waterfall doesn't just flow up and down, it always flows down to the next level, to the next lowest point, right? In the river, I guess. And the same analogy applies here in React. The parent component passes data down and it flows down to the child. The child can take that data and add something on top of it, maybe some additional data, an additional array or object or string, and pass it down as well. But each individual child component in that hierarchy should never modify or mutate any data that it receives from its parent or anywhere above itself in that tree, in that hierarchy, in that diagram, if you will. So this is a very high-level technical explanation, but I promise props will make sense, and they're a lot simpler than they may sound in this presentation, and you'll see that when we actually go into the editor. The key takeaway in this lesson is props is essentially data that we can pass down from a parent component to a child component, and that is what is going to allow us to enable customization and dynamic content within our taco card component. And we're going to see how that unfolds in the upcoming lessons. So I will see you there.